My name is Ronald Leonard Mason. I was born in Winnipeg, Manitoba, Canada. My father was raised in an orphanage in England, and he was one of 11 brothers. And his mother couldn't afford to care for the boys, and so they all lived in the orphanage. When he was 13, the Salvation Army sponsored him as a farm worker who could emigrate to Canada and work on farms. And he had received some training at the orphanage about I don't know what, about using a scythe, maybe, things like that. And so he came to Canada and eventually emigrated to Winnipeg and met my mother, who was fresh off the farm. My mother was a farm girl, and she was born in Bengoff, Saskatchewan, in the middle of nowhere. We lived in a humble little frame house on the fringe of Winnipeg, right on the edge of the Canadian bush. And there were no other houses around us. We were pretty isolated. In my young years, I spent a lot of my time alone in the bush, wandering around in the bush, and I just loved it. It was just such a fantastic experience, and I think it instilled in me an immense respect for nature, and that became a very important part of my life. We ended up selling everything we owned and getting on a Greyhound bus and coming to Denver and moving into a motel. But we came here because he had heard that there was a huge housing boom taking place, and because he was a house painter, this was a great opportunity for more work and more money. And so we arrived here when I was 14 years old. Being connected to John Anderson was probably one of the greatest things that's ever happened to me in my life. He's such a fine man. He really is. And, you know, I couldn't believe it, but he chose me to be the president of the firm. And I, you know, I invested myself in a big way in the firm, and you know, we grew the firm, and the firm got bigger and bigger, and we took on more and more significant projects, and the firm became one of the significant firms in Colorado. And but one of the things that was always difficult for me in the firm of Anderson Mason Dale is that almost all of our work was public sector work. And when you work in the public sector, you invariably end up working with committees and groups of people that believe consensus is the proper way to design projects. And if there's one thing that I've always been, I've been a fighter. If I believe in something, watch out. And I've been passionate about doing good work, designing buildings that are beautiful, and so many times I got myself into trouble on that. So being the president of Anderson Mason Dale it was kind of a rocky road a few times. You know, I remember, you know, when you work with committees, they can just drive you crazy. Rarely do you find a strong leader, and you end up becoming subversive. You have to veil your intentions about what it is that you think is really important. And like you never want to talk about design. You want to talk about money and you want to talk about function, but you don't talk about design because that doesn't really resonate with most people in the way we wish it did. And so you become subversive and you present things in a way that allow you to talk about money and about function, when in fact, what you're really talking about is design. The scariest thing that ever happened to me was associated with the Denver Public Library downtown. And our firm was hired to do a planning study for the Denver Public Library site. It was very clear that the director of the library had his own agenda. And he didn't really want to hear what we thought could be done with the Denver Public Library site. He was convinced that he wanted to just build a new building somewhere else. I convinced my partners that we would withdraw from the planning study and that we wrote a letter to the Library Commission and we told them that this was basically a dishonest process and that we could not be a part of it. And of course, Jennifer Moulton, who was the president of Historic Denver at that time, she just loved me for that, for taking that position, because she wanted the Burnham Hoyt building to stay as, you know, part of the Denver Public Library. And so she and I talked and she came up with this idea, okay, why don't I pay your firm $1 to do a study of and show how you can keep the Burnham Hoyt building. Well, we did a lot of crazy things in our office, but the craziest thing we ever did is that we stopped work on all office projects for a week. We shut the phones down. We had a recording just saying that we're not reachable. We have this very important project that we're working on. And what we were doing is we were designing the new library connected to the Burnham Hoyt Library on that site. And we developed all these floor plans that were very complex to accommodate the program needs of the new library. And we did a color rendering of the building. It cost us a lot of money. And then the Library Commission wanted to see it. And I remember I had to make the presentation. And I don't think I've ever felt so much pressure in my entire life as I did when I walked into the commission meeting and the council members were there and other civic prominent people, and the place was packed with people. And I got up and I made this presentation in front of the library director, who just hated me, right? And I convinced the Library Commission that you could do it. And the next day in the Rocky Mountain News, in the editorial page, it said somebody should buy Ron Mason the entire set of Shakespeare because of what he has given this city. And of course, then we had this competition, and Michael Graves won the competition, and you can judge the building for whatever you think, but the library stayed on Civic Center. And one of the reasons that we had such a good firm, and of course the firm continues today, and the firm today is doing great things. And I knew it all along. I hired those guys. And I always said that if you put the four partners of Anderson, Mason, Dale in front of smart people, they're going to get the job. And they have gotten a lot of jobs and with repeat clients. But when I was really active in the practice with John Anderson and Curt Dale, we had kind of a magical relationship that Andy was the guy that was interested in marketing, and being the rainmaker. And Curt was the guy that was really interested in the technology aspect of the firm, and I was interested in design. And so we didn't really ever compete with each other on that basis, but we had all the bases covered. It was a very powerful relationship in that way. Curt meant so much to me because he and our offices were right next to each other, and whenever I was faced with something I didn't know how to do, I'd go knock on Curt's desk, and he was a patient guy, and he'd say, "You can do it this way." And he was a smart guy. One day, Curt and I were walking out of the office at noon on Friday, and I said, "Where are you going this weekend?" Because he was always going somewhere. He loved to climb. And he said, "Well, we're going to go up and we're going to do Elkhead Pass." And I said, "Well, you know, I'm going to be up our place." I said, "Well, you can drop by after you do your ski over Elkhead Pass. Come on back by my place." Well, he never showed up. And the next day on Monday, we were sitting in the conference room at our early morning management meeting, and Pam walked into the conference room and basically collapsed on the floor, telling us that Curt had died in an avalanche. And that was crushing. The project that I think I'm most proud of is the visitor complex at Mount Rushmore National Memorial. And believe it or not, I worked on that project for 10 years with the National Park Service. 10 consecutive years. And I never got myself crosswise with any of those guys, like I did on so many other projects. It was amazing that we got it all done. It really was, because it went, as you might imagine, it went through the highest review process that you could ever imagine. That's why it took so long, too, to get it done. So I'm very, very proud of that. Well, I think you just have to strip away all notions about style. You know, so many of the buildings that are around today, they're all about style. And, you know, a lot of them are beautiful, you know, but they're not timeless. They date themselves very quickly because they're so much about today, and, you know, looking cool and all of that. When we did Mount Rushmore, I wanted the work to just be background work. This is not about us. It's not about these buildings. It's about that sculpture. And so everything we did played to that kind of thinking. It's rare that you have an opportunity to do a building and walk away from it and see it 2 or 3 years later and not see, you know, how it could have been better. So many times it could have been better. I got into kayaking in my last year, my junior year at CU Boulder, and the way that happened was that I was driving down an alleyway here in Denver, and I saw a backyard full of kayaks. And so the kayak, it was a beautiful object, and I loved to draw it. And I drew it so many times, and it was really an inspiring thing to me. But I completely forgot about it until I happened to see this backyard full of kayaks. And I thought, God, I have to find out why this guy has so many kayaks. I drove around to the front of the house and rang the bell, and this guy came to the door, and I started talking to him. And before I left his house, he had convinced me to build a kayak in his living room. This guy was insane. And he was one of the early fiberglass kayak builders here in the States. And so I got this kayak finished, and it was so beautiful. And every time I got into it, it was just this fantastic experience. And I had never any intentions of really using it. I just wanted to have it. And then he convinced me to go up on the South Platte River near Deckers and try this kayak in the river, and I did, and I got hooked, and I got so hooked that I spent years after that in whitewater kayaking, and I became one of the best whitewater kayakers in the United States. I was in the Olympic trials. I was the national freestyle champion in kayaking. I was silver medalist in the world in the U.S. Championships, and made first descents of rivers like the Animas and the Black Canyon of the Gunnison, and made descents of so many rivers. I got to the point where I was just always wanting to be in the river, in the boat, and I got so that it became a Zen-like thing for me. I felt like I could give myself to the river every time I got into a boat, and to be a great kayaker, you have to become a part of the water. You have to be willing to let it take you and to understand how to use its power to do the moves that you want to do. And so I could be getting into a kayak next to a raging rapid, and it would be just as comfortable for me as sitting in this chair. I spent a lot of time on the Arkansas River, and always dreaming about the idea of having a cabin on the river with my kayaks there. And one day I was talking to this rancher about trying to buy a piece of his property, and he wasn't interested. But he said, the other day I was talking to this woman who has a mining claim, and she is interested in selling it. And I got her name, and I went and looked her up, and she and her husband drove me up to this mining claim, which was right on the Arkansas River. And so I ended up buying this property, 17 acres, for $14,000. And then I wanted to live on the land, but I had no money to build anything except a teepee. And so I got a permit from the National Forest Service to cut teepee poles in the forest, and then they were all peeled with a draw knife, and I had my teepee there. And at that time I was working for John Anderson, and I convinced John that I needed to take some summers off and teach kayaking. And so he was so good to me in that respect, and so many others. So I ended up teaching kayaking and living in a teepee, and my kids would come up maybe on weekends or something like that, but that was my base. And that was a very spiritual kind of time for me to live in a teepee, because I don't know whether you've spent time in a teepee, but the teepee is probably one of the most beautiful enclosures that man has ever invented. And to live in a teepee and to experience just the poetic, soothing light that comes, through the canvas and the shadows of the teepee poles that are being cast on a conical surface is really quite amazing. And so I remember at one point John Anderson drove up with his wife to where I was, and he said, "When are you going to come back to work?" I went to Finland, and I got to see this great tradition of log building in Finland. It just inspired me so much that when I came back, I thought, I have to have a log cabin. And so I scraped money together, and I ended up getting a loan, get this, from Colorado National Bank at 18% interest. 18% interest. That's how crazy I was to build this building. And I got it built, and it was fantastic. We started building buildings. That's what we wanted to do. So every summer, we'd try to build a building. We built a lot of buildings, and we have, I think, 10 buildings up there now. So it's become a settlement. I like that word. And it's all sort of strung out along the edge of the river. In many ways, it has the same kind of pattern of organization that you'd find in some of the old mining towns. You know, not a great degree of organization, because all the way, pretty much all along, I never really had a lot of money where I could have this great plan. It was sort of like, let's just do one more building. One of the most important things for someone who is entering the profession is to be very selective about where they work, because I believe it's that first firm, or maybe that first and second firm that you work for, that will have a really immense impact on the way that you think. In its best form, it'll teach you civic responsibility, the proper way to live and be an architect. It teaches you so many things if you get into a great firm. I was fortunate enough to get into Pay's firm, and I think today there's a lot of young people at Anderson Mason Dale, and I think, boy, you're lucky to be in this firm, because this is a terrific firm. This firm is making money, and it's doing good work, and it has repeat clients and lots of perks, and yeah, so where you work when you get out of college is extremely important. I wouldn't change anything. I absolutely would not. For me, my life has been completely fulfilling in every way, and I never had any idea that I would ever be a principal in an architecture firm, let alone being president of an architecture firm, let alone being a fellow. None of that ever occurred to me. I just happened to be in the right place at the right time, and that's why I say I wouldn't change anything about my life. It's all kind of come to me in the most beautiful way.